Wondrous Destiny-Ch. Chapter 29.
They grabbed various rocks and put them in their pockets. They walked several minutes towards the castle gate and began to throw rocks from various parts. The rocks disintegrated soon after they hit the plasma barrier. Orion then rode his dragon and commanded the dragon to throw fire at the plasma barrier. The barrier seemed to integrate the fire into the structure. Some sages were seen laughing through the barrier at the other side of the castle gate. "Let's concentrate all our powers at the bottom of the barrier," Orion said. All the dragons threw fire at the bottom of the barrier where it met the ground. Nothing happened. "We need magic," Orion said. Crimson began to dig the soil right next to where the barrier hit the ground, but the barrier seemed to expand where he had dug through the ground, and he did not want to risk hitting the barrier again. "You're right. We do need magic," said Crimson. They were all exhausted and retreated back to the woods. "We need to rest," said Orion. "Sounds like a good idea," Mr. Napoleon agreed. It was night and cold. They made a bonfire and fell asleep. Wolves howled from afar. They laid down, defeated in their hearts, exhausted. After a few hours, a crackling of twigs nearby woke up Mr. Napoleon. "Wake up," he said. "Someone is coming. We're under attack." Crimson and Orion drew their swords and stood up, still half asleep. "Where?" Orion asked. "From there, I think," Mr. Napoleon said, pointing at an area of the woods in the opposite direction of where the castle was. "It's an ambush," cried Orion. "The dragons went to eat with my legion. We are alone. Prepare to fight from both sides." They drew their swords ready to attack as they heard the footsteps become louder and clearer. Mr. Napoleon gulped. Orion had his eyes locked on the trees, looking for someone or something hiding. Mrs. Layla held on to Mr. Napoleon. Crimson was sweating and breathing rapidly. Although his heart was pumping fast, he didn't even notice it. The cold of the night felt more piercing than ever. It even felt numbing. The footsteps were now only a few meters away. They were about to come out of the trees any second. Then they stopped. No noise was heard. Nobody knew what was happening. The only sound was the wolves from afar and the crackling of the fire embers left from the bonfire. After a few seconds, a voice was heard. "Here they are," exclaimed a female voice. "It is them," exclaimed a male voice. 3 humanoid figures could now be seen coming out from the trees. They were hiding. Crimson and company still couldn't make out who they were. They only saw the dark silhouettes, like standing shadows in the night. "Crimson," yelled the female voice, in a bright, high-pitched voice. Crimson glanced at Orion, raising his eyebrow. Orion shook his head and raised his shoulders, signaling he had no idea who it was. The silhouette then came dashing towards Crimson. "Ah!" Crimson screamed, now terrified, taking a guard stance with his sword. But as the silhouette came closer, Crimson was finally able to see who it was. He noticed her mushroom-shaped hat. Molly? His first thought. Could it be? Then the light reached her, and he could see clearly who it was. "Iconies," Crimson yelled. "You scared me." "I can see that," she replied with a giggle. Crimson then rushed to greet her. He hugged her. Squeezed her, rather. "I'm so glad to see you, dear," he said to her. "So am I, dear," Iconies whispered, smiling, closing her eyes. They both seemed to be lost in time with that embrace. The other 2 silhouettes made their way into the spectacle. "Capra, Raven," said Mrs. Layla. "You know them?" asked Mr. Napoleon, raising his eyebrows, glancing her way. "It doesn't take a genius to figure out that a white goat face is a capra and a black masked and hooded face resembles a raven," she replied. "Capra, Raven," Crimson exclaimed, opening his eyes. He then rushed to greet him. He hugged them. "Glad to see us?" "Dear," Capra said jokingly. They all laughed and Crimson blushed. "I'm glad you're back, Iconies," Orion said, and company. He bowed to Capra and Raven. "Thank you much for coming." "I'm glad to be back," Iconies said, glancing at Crimson and smiling at him. Crimson blushed a little more, but smiled back and then lowered his head. "How's the face-off going?" asked Capra, referencing the battle ahead. "Not good," said Orion. "The sages within the castle walls have summoned a protective barrier all around the castle. We can't penetrate it. We've tried." "What happens?" asked Capra. "Better yet, take me to it." "This way, Sir Capra, and thank you," said Orion, extending his hand up towards the castle, signaling the direction. They all walked towards the castle, close enough so that they could see the white plasma bubble encapsulating the castle. "Avidin Nudamark," said Raven, looking at the protective barrier. "Looks like someone remembers their protective barrier spells lessons well," said Capra. "Good job, Raven." Everyone else looked at each other, then back to Capra. "It is almost impossible even for powerful magicians to break through it," said Raven. "Indeed," affirmed Capra. "That's why we're not breaking through it. We're going to break the circle that is holding it together." "You mean the circle of sages that is inside the castle?" asked Mr. Napoleon. "Indeed," said Capra, with his eyes locked towards the castle. "But how are we going to get to it?" asked Raven. "The circle is inside the castle, which is being protected by a barrier which we cannot get through. There is another spell that could work, but I need an item that connects to one of the sages there," said Capra. "An item like what?" asked Orion. "A piece of cloth, a piece of hair, any physical object that can relate to them," said Capra. "How would we get any of that?" asked Raven. "Every physical object that connects to them is in there with them." There was silence. Capra smiled and looked at Raven, expecting a response from him. "What about music?" Crimson finally asked. "Uh-huh," exclaimed Capra. "Go on, Sir Crimson." "Well, music can travel in wave form, and if we play a melody or sing a lullaby about those sages, it will, by definition, connect to them. It's only a theory, though." "Brilliant," exclaimed Capra. "You should enroll in my school of magic, Sir Crimson." "Why didn't I know that?" complained Raven. "I went to school of magic. You were my teacher there, Capra." "If I recall correctly now, you were absent the day of that lesson, Raven," Capra replied. "That was about 60 years ago, Capra. How could you recall such a specific thing?" Raven continued complaining. "Well, you know now," Capra replied, smiling. "Ugh," exclaimed Raven. "So would that work?" asked Orion. "That music spell thing Crimson mentioned." "It can, but it has to be a good enough song. A song that talks about the sages, or at least one of the sages," replied Capra. "Anyone know how to play music here?" "I can play the flute and the harp," said Icones. "I can sing and play guitar," said Crimson. "Someone has to write the words for the song," said Capra. "Any poets here?" "I'll write it," said Mrs. Layla unexpectedly. "At least I'll try." "Very well. Work on the melody, Icones and Crimson and Mrs. Layla?" Capra asked as he glanced at her, not sure that was her name. "Yes, that's right." Layla affirmed that was her name. "Mrs. Layla, you work on writing the words for the song." Crimson and Icones took out their instruments and began humming possible melodies and playing beautiful harmonies, while Mrs. Layla began to look for something to write in. "I don't have a pencil," she said. "Gee, why didn't anyone bring a pen to battle?" asked Mr. Napoleon, with a sarcastic tone. "Use my blood as ink," said Crimson. "Whoa. Careful now, boy," warned Capra in a serious tone. "You might not want to connect that deep with those sages." "Use the hunt's blood as ink, rather," he instructed. They gathered blood from the game they had hunted for food, and Mrs. Layla used it for ink. She wrote the song on a large piece of rock. "O sages of the west, sages of the north, sages of the south and sages of the east, you all meet and greet, not knowing you will face defeat. You hide behind castle walls and offer evil's hand your fireballs. Forces of love are stronger than forces of greed. Soon you will regret doing evil deeds. Wise sages, are you wise enough to know that when thy power is used for good, your aura glows? Don't give in to darkness or fear, or else you'll see your end is near. Brilliant, exclaimed Capra as he read it. I think it needs work, said Mrs. Layla. If only I. No time to change it. Orion interrupted. As long as it serves its purpose. Very well, said Capra. Icones, Crimson. Are you ready with the melody? Icones and Crimson had been working on the melody and now had something good to propose. Listen to this, said Crimson. Crimson began to play the guitar, and Icones came in with a melody in her flute. Then Crimson began to hum a melody on top. I like it, said Capra. That should work. Let's make a circle. This is what we will do. I will sit in the middle of the circle, close my eyes, and meditate. Crimson and Icones will begin to play that song, and Crimson will sing the harmony he hummed, but now singing the poem Mrs. Layla wrote. You will do this until I say stop. Understood. Okay, Crimson replied. Understood, said Icones. Very well, said Capra. We shall commence. They drew a circle with a stick, and Capra sat in the middle. Crimson sat at the side of the circle towards the back, and Icones sat on the left side of the circle towards the back. Capra was in front to the left of Crimson, and to the front and right of Icones. The stone with the poem written in blood was in the very front of them all, facing the castle. Orion, draw a line to connect all of our positions with your sword, said Capra. Orion did this. Once the lines were drawn out on the floor, if one could see the circle from above, a round peace symbol would be shown. Begin chanting the melody, instructed Capra. Icones and Crimson began to play and sing the melody, and Capra closed his eyes. He was sitting Indian style. He meditated for several minutes, then he finally spoke. Diminaski Divitrium, said Capra repeatedly, reciting the spell. Diminaski Divitrium, he said louder and louder, for more than a minute. Capra imagined, with his eyes closed, the waves of the melody piercing through the plasma barrier spell surrounding the castle. He imagined riding that wave and breaking through with it. Once he saw himself inside the castle walls, past the plasma barrier, he opened his eyes. Ah, Mr. Napoleon gasped. Look at his eyes. They look like blue fire. Capra was still sitting down with his blue-flamed eyes and had his eyes locked on the castle. His eyes were shining bright blue, almost white. His pupils were barely noticeable. He stopped reciting the spell. Capra then imagined being there and now focused the wave towards one of the sages inside there, one standing close to the circle they had established there. Ah, gasped the sage inside the castle walls. The others glanced at him. Something is up. The spirit is here, he said. What? The others asked. Capra then tried to focus more of the wave towards him. All of it. The sage cried. He then fell to the floor, breaking the circle. After a few seconds, the plasma ball barrier began to disintegrate. What happened to you? Asked the sages, looking at the sage that fell. Are you possessed? Something is in here. Something pushed me very hard, he said. Oh, Lord Dark Shadow, another sage screamed. Someone has broken in. Lord Dark Shadow was inside the castle, and a soldier went to look for him. Stop singing now, Capra exclaimed back in camp. We broke through. If we continue the chant, they will locate us. Prepare to fight. Orion summoned the dragons, which came to the spot. Orion and his legion went on dragon back, while Crimson drew his sword and charged. The rest followed. Inside the castle walls, Lord Dark Shadow came out. What has happened? He exclaimed. Something invisible broke into the barrier, cried one of the sages. It looks like it possessed a sage and threw him to the ground. Lord Dark Shadow then saw the circle broken and the sage still in the ground, shocked, unwilling to get up. He then glanced outside the castle walls. Diminaski Divitrium, muttered Lord Dark Shadow, looking outside. What was that? Is that a spirit? Asked the sage. Someone has used a spell to break through, exclaimed Lord Dark Shadow. But how? Asked the sage. We haven't gone outside the castle in many months. Prepare to battle, yelled Lord Dark Shadow. You all need to go back to magic school. He growled at the sage. Someone summon Commander Fiamma. We will fight fire with fire, magic with magic, and sword with sword. A soldier went inside the castle to call for Commander Fiamma. Commander Fiamma. Lord Dark Shadow orders you and your dragons to ready yourselves for battle, said the sage when he reached Fiamma, who was at a kitchen table eating pork. Already, he responded, taking a bite of his meat. I thought it would take them days to break through if they ever could. They're approaching the castle as we speak, Lord, said the sage. Ah, he banged the table and stood up. He then lifted the sage from his chest robe. I will crush them and ash them for interrupting my meal, he growled.